Today we'll be talking about Chapter 2, Section 1, and it's called City-States in Mesopotamia. And these are some of the earliest civilizations, and they are in Asia. The earliest civilizations in what we today call the Middle East occurred in the land of Mesopotamia. And another interesting historical concept we're going to study is the idea of a city-state. A gathering of people that is also an independent political unit. And so we'll look at what that means as we get into this section. So first off, the earliest civilizations are in an area of land that today we call the Fertile Crescent. And we still use the term the Fertile Crescent because if you go to the Middle East, or if you've seen videos or movies about the Middle East, much of it is desert. Very dry, very hot. Nothing like the rainfall that we get here. But then say if you go to the city of Jerusalem, or say the city of Baghdad, or the city of Damascus, or even the ancient site of the city of Ur, you'll find that these places actually get a fair amount of rainfall. Not the 80 inches a year like we've dealt with in this crazy year that we've had, but still enough rainfall to support farming settlements, to support a large population. And so it's for that reason that the land of Mesopotamia, which means the land between the rivers, is the site of the oldest civilizations in the world. Now, the two rivers I'm talking about here are the Tigris and the Euphrates. Now, we'll also be talking about the Yellow River and the Huanghe in China soon. And civilizations there emerged around the same time. Because if you go back to Chapter 1 and you study some of the prehistoric stuff, you'll find that the hunter-gatherers, the cavemen, the wandering nomadic groups traveled all around the world for many years. But around 40,000 BCE, farming was discovered in what's called the Neolithic Revolution. And the first farms, the oldest ones that we have found, are located between these two rivers in what is today Iraq, the nation of Iraq, the Tigris and the Euphrates. These rivers are significant in many of the Middle Eastern cultures and are considered the cradle of civilization. In fact, in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, the Tigris and Euphrates are mentioned as the mysterious Garden of Eden. And in Babylonian legends, again, this is considered the cradle of civilization. So here it is on the map. You can see that Mesopotamia, once more translated as the land between the rivers, is smack dab in the middle of what is today Baghdad. It was once called the city of Babylon. So the modern city of Baghdad is literally built on the ancient ruins of the city of Babylon. But of course, a few other places you'll recognize. This is the modern state of Israel, recreated in 1948. Syria, I'm sure you've heard about the civil wars there. Everybody's heard about Iraq. You've probably also heard about Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. And this is kind of the region that we'll be talking about today. So what was it like there? Well, the first farming settlements in Mesopotamia date back to around 3300 BCE. 3300 BCE. That's a really long time ago. Now, in terms of geologic history, it's a blip on the radar. You know, when you think of the existence of the cosmos and the Big Bang, and et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of human history, it's still somewhat a blip on the radar. You know, because in Chapter 1, if you go back and read it, you'll learn about how there was the Homo habilis, and then the Australopithecines, and then finally the Homo sapiens that beat out the Neanderthals for dominance, and then so on and so forth. But we're starting with the first farming settlements. And it's very significant. These are the oldest settled communities in the world, dating back to around 3300 BCE in Mesopotamia. Now, the earliest peoples that lived there were called the Sumerians. The Sumerians. And they began farming there. And it was this discovery of farming that allowed people to build settled communities. Because imagine if you're one of these hunter-gatherer nomads, maybe like the Asiatic nomads that crossed the Bering Strait somewhere around 40,000 BCE. Those nomadic groups crossed the Bering Strait along frozen glaciers in Arctic conditions because they had to hunt to survive. And their prey crossed the Bering Strait, and so did they. And that's how people came to the Western Hemisphere, and we'll get to that later. But this discovery of farming allowed people to not have to move constantly, to get to build a house and stay in the same place. It's safer, it's easier, it's better for everybody. But there's some environmental problems that go along with living in one place. Well, the obvious one is what we're dealing with now. By the way, don't go to Jackson Park right now. Why don't you want to go to Jackson Park right now? It's a lake, yeah. Sometimes I like to ride my bike in Hendersonville. I drop my car off at North Main. I ride to school. Every now and then you'll see my bike out here on a nice day. And I found out the hard way on several occasions that Jackson Park floods and that the Greenway floods. And I've had, it's just, okay, flooding is an annoyance here. And maybe for some of you it's a really scary thing you're dealing with right now. Flooding in ancient times was a matter of life and death. For example, we're going to talk about another ancient river civilization called the Harappans in India. They lived along the Indus River Valley, the oldest people to have lived in the Indus River Valley. Well, the city of Harappa disappeared. All that is left of it is ruin. We don't know why. We don't know what happened to those people. We still don't know what happened to those people. One of the guesses is a flood. Just wiped them out. And so you have to wonder where those legends of the flood in the Old Testament came from. Were there floods like this in river civilizations where just killed everybody? Maybe. Okay, so flooding's a problem. The opposite is true as well. Sometimes drought is a problem. There's a story in the book of Genesis about a man named Joseph who came to Egypt to help out Egypt during a terrible drought. Drought could get so bad in these ancient river civilizations that rivers would practically dry up. And there wouldn't be enough water for farmers to farm their crops. And so farms would dry up and people would starve to death. Again, droughts here can be annoying because you're like, oh man, my water bill went up, or oh man, the swimming hole I like to go to is really low right now, or oh man, it's just really hot, I could use some rain. Droughts in the ancient world can be a matter of life and death. The next problem, if you go to Mesopotamia, or even if you just look at it on a map, you'll notice that it's right in the middle. That's why it's called the Middle East. It's right in the middle of three major continents: Africa, Asia, and Europe. And guess what? People are traveling through Mesopotamia all of the time. And this is great if you're a business person. This is bad for invasion. You see, Mesopotamia was constantly being invaded. If you look at the history, it was the Akkadians, and then it was the Sumerians. Well, no, Sumerians, then Akkadians. Then it was the Assyrians. Then it was the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans, etc., etc., etc. These folks are always getting conquered. So that's the bad side about living in prime real estate. And then finally, even though it's called the Fertile Crescent, these lands still have few natural resources. And of course that makes building materials scarce. So how did these ancient people solve these problems? And so, by the way, if you're using the note-taking guide, the answer to the first question is right here in parentheses. Handy little number 1. Again, the note-taking guides are extra credit, but if you'd like to do them, again, the answer to number 2 is there, the answer to number 3, etc., etc. Okay, so how do you solve these problems? Well, the interesting thing about the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament was that he came to help the Egyptians. by teaching them how to store grain in preparation for a drought, or to, and this isn't contained in that story, but farmers learned to dig irrigation ditches. So if there's not rainfall, they can tap into a nearby river, build their farm near the river, irrigate their crops by routing a little piece of the river around their field. In regards to the problem of invasion, well, all of these ancient cities had walls. You know, it was said when the Assyrians dominated the region, their capital city was at Nineveh. They were a bloodthirsty and cruel people. But the legend said that the walls of Nineveh were so large and thick that 2 men could ride horses atop the walls side by side all the way around the city. And so walls were an effective defense in ancient times. They weren't foolproof. We'll talk about how the Assyrians were famous at toppling walled cities and the things that they would do to the people when they got in there. You know, spoiler alert, it's pretty terrible. Well, then finally, the issue of scarcity can be overcome with trade. If I'm short of something, but Lucas has an abundance of it, but he needs something else, we can trade for it. And so trade emerged in these settlements. And so this type of organization is the essence of civilization.
My grandfather says that in the old days, most everybody had to work at farming the land. But not anymore. We Sumerians got so good at growing food, some people could quit farming and let others grow enough for everybody. Of course, you had to be neighbors for that to work. So people settled down close to each other in villages. And the villages grew into city-states. Each city-state has its own king, and each one is sacred to one of the gods. My city-state is called Nippur. It's on the banks of the Euphrates River, and it's the most holy city in all of Sumer. Nippur is sacred to the god Enlil, our greatest god. His temple, the ziggurat, is right in the middle of the city. Our ziggurat is named Eduranki, which means the house binding heaven and earth. The ziggurat is a huge square building, sort of like a pyramid. It's made of several layers, or stories. As you go higher up, each story is smaller than the one below. The very top story is the temple, where the god lives. Around the ziggurat are houses where the wealthy people live, like priests and merchants, for instance. They live in 2-story houses. Further away from the temple are 1-story houses where shopkeepers and craftspeople live. And beyond them live the farmers and fishermen. All the land outside the city belongs to the city-state too, but most people live inside the city walls. We are very good at making bricks out of mud. That's a good thing because there's a lot of mud here. We gather a bunch of mud, pat it into square molds, and bake the mud bricks in the sun until they're dry. We use them to make all of our buildings.
Now, the first city-states. By 3000 BCE, the Sumerians had built these cities. Now, typically the structure of these cities, where you've got your religious building in the center, and it was called a ziggurat, and I've got a picture of one here. And then you have your government buildings right around that. You've got your residential structures, homes and whatnot, and then surrounded by fields. The homes and the cities and the religious buildings would be protected by the wall, and the fields would be outside of the wall. And then raiding people could loot and pillage and burn the farms and leave, but the people would be safe within. Each of these city-states is an independent political unit, meaning that if you lived in Ur, which Ur is an actual ancient city, it's one of the oldest ones, in fact. If you lived in Ur, your city had a wall around it, and you didn't trust the people from Damascus. Even though Damascus wasn't that far away, you just didn't trust those people. Why? Because they're from a different city-state. Because they're as likely to come and steal and burn your stuff and kill you as they are to trade with you. And so you're going to be cautious, and you're going to build a wall around your city and protect yourself. And you're going to rule your own business, or at least the people within ruled their own affairs. And so there were different city-states even by 3000 BCE. There was the city-state of Uruk, of Kish, of Lagash, of Umma, and then of course my favorite, Ur. Each city-state had their own temple. Again, they're called ziggurats, like the picture. They had their own priest, and most of them had their own gods. Oh yes, each one of them had different gods they worshipped. Some had the same, eventually these folks would unite and their cultures would blend, but as they began, each had their own independent names for their own deities.
Here's my house. My family lives in one of the 2-story houses close to the ziggurat. That's because my dad works for the king. My mom runs the house. Our slaves do the actual work, but my mom supervises them. They prepare meals, keep the house clean, and do other household chores. Mother also weaves beautiful cloth to make clothing. Her cloth is made of fine wool from our own sheep. She sells a lot of it to the traders' caravans. My younger sisters help my mom spin yarn and weave cloth. But I begged my dad to send me to tablet school. I'm learning to write so I can be a scribe. It's a really important job. There are a lot of other jobs in Sumer, like being a potter or a fisherman. Some people grind grain into flour and brew beer. Some are traders, and some just play music. Hey, that wouldn't be so bad. But it would be bad to be a slave. Some slaves were captured in war, and others became slaves because they owed money. They have to work for 3 years, often in the grain fields, and then they are set free. Besides the king and his family, the people with the highest positions are the priests. They care for the gods and make sure they're happy.
Here's a zoom in of the ziggurat. They tended to resemble towers because for the ancient peoples, think about like what you don't understand, you tend to ascribe to a deity. Okay, so, we don't know what happens when we die. The science, of course, is that your brain turns off and that your body rots and all that. But, of course, since no one has ever died and come back, it's a mystery. What happens to your consciousness? Does anything happen, or does it just turn off like the rest of you? And that's where a lot of religions have sprouted up to explain that mystery. Someday if we have somebody die and come back and scientists study it and repeat it in a laboratory setting, then sure, okay, the mystery will be solved. But now, since it is still a mystery, well, that's what we talk about in our particular religions. But when we talk about the sun today, that's a scientific phenomenon, right? We know from science class that the sun is the largest body in the solar system and that the planets revolve around it because of gravity and that the sun appears to go up and go down, but in fact that's the rotation of the earth. Okay, so we've just explained the sun away. Well, guess what? For the ancient peoples of Ur, the sun was the most important god there was. The sun wasn't just the largest gravitational body in the Milky Way that the planets revolved around because of the gravitational circumference of its mass and blah, blah, blah. They didn't know all that mess. We do, sure. Instead, they built towers to the sun to try to get closer to it. Now, I get that that shows a basic lack of understanding in astronomy. Okay, I get that. But primitive peoples tended to ascribe religious significance to the things they did not understand. Think of the Greeks. There was a god for the wind, there was a god for the sea, there was a god for the lightning, there was a god for the sun, etc., etc. Okay, so let's zoom in of these ancient city-states. First, and we're looking at an actual photograph of Ur. This photograph was taken in 1930. As soon as they unearthed the area, they began to study it. And so now if you took an aerial photograph, if you go on Google Earth and look at Ur, it's still there, but it's surrounded by all kinds of architectural studies and archaeologists and so forth and so on. So this is one of the early photographs. And I like this one because it's pretty well preserved in this photograph. So there's the ziggurat. And I know you can't really see it, but number 1 there is representing the ziggurat. Okay, number 2. This is the court of Nana. This was the sacred temple devoted to the moon god. Okay, let me burst your bubble. The moon is a small planetary body that orbits the Earth. It orbits the Earth because of gravitational rotation due to its large mass. It affects tidal currents and waves, etc. It also provides a source of light because it reflects light from the sun even after the rotation of the Earth has gone past the exposure to the sun. Right? There's the sciencey stuff. But let's get back to the religious-y stuff. If you're a primitive man, you don't understand what the moon is. What do you think the moon is? Well, some ancient cultures said that the moon was a goddess, that the sun was male and the moon was female. And these folks worshipped the goddess Nana, their name for the moon. Okay, number 5 here, another temple. They have lots of these. Why? Because there's lots of things they don't understand. They have a god of weather. Okay, what causes weather? Okay, so in an area with abundant rainfall, there's also abundant standing water. Water evaporates, as we know, because of the atmosphere. That evaporation gets trapped in the atmosphere. The higher it goes, it turns to ice, and then it eventually melts, and it becomes solid and falls down, turns back into water, and becomes rain. So there's my layman's version of why we have weather. Obviously, it's more complex. But the point is we can explain it scientifically. But the people of Ur could not. And ergo, they had a god for their weather. This is also their administrative buildings. It's basically the center of the city. There's the wall. I know it doesn't look that impressive. Here's the home of the high priestess. And so another fun fact about these ancient cities is that since they had so many mysteries, they had to have somebody to interpret the mysteries. There needed to be somebody to climb that tower, and that's what the tower looked like in real life. There needed to be somebody to climb it to tell us what the sun was up to, or at least to make up a good story about what the sun was up to. And these people had an awful lot of power. And that's why we have a separation of church and state in our countries, because we recognize that religious people can gain a scary amount of power. And then finally, the royal cemetery. It's where the kings are buried. Of course, we know the kings in Egypt were all buried in pyramids. Now, in the city-state of Ur, which was a Sumerian city-state, meaning that they belonged to the ethnic group of the Sumerians, that they spoke the language of Sumer. These early governments were often controlled by temple priests. Controlled, meaning that the priest had an awful lot of power. Not every one of these city-states was controlled by a religion, however. In many cases, the leaders were warriors, were warrior kings, chieftains, powerful leaders that nobody messed with because they've each killed 100 people personally. Don't mess with that guy. He'll hit you with a club so hard your head will fall off. Do what he says. And these warrior kings often became rulers of their city-states. And this is where dynasties come from. So when Sargon of Akkad conquered the great and terrible empire that became the Assyrians, he passed on his legacy to his son, who passed on his legacy to his son until someone killed them and then started their own empire. And so these city-states became numerous, increasingly so as time went on. And even though they often warred with one another, they also did an awful lot of trade, an awful lot of communication, commerce, exchanged ideas, exchanged cultures, intermarried, so on and so forth. And that's called cultural diffusion.
That reminds me, I should write something about our religion. It plays a big part in our lives. We believe in 7 great gods of the earth, sky, sun, moon, salt water, fresh water, and wind. My city, Nippur, is protected by the god Enlil, the god of wind. We believe he lives in his temple on top of the ziggurat. We spend a lot of time praying to our gods. A lot of people even make a little statue of themselves praying and leave it in the temple. The statues keep on praying while the people go about their daily chores. Our priests hold ceremonies to honor the gods and offer them food twice each day. My older brother Shulgi is a priest in the ziggurat. Only priests are allowed inside. Shulgi reminds me of that every chance he gets. We believe the gods own the land and everything on it. So we give the gods everything we grow. Then the priests share it with all the people. They make sure everyone gets enough.
Speaking of Sumerian culture, these folks believed in lots of different gods, if you haven't gotten to that already. That's called polytheism, as opposed to monotheism. So say if you are a Muslim, or if you are a Christian, or if you are a Jew, you are monotheist. But if you are a Sumerian, you believe in the god of Belial, you believe in the god of Asher, you believe in the goddess Nana, and you believe in all these different gods. Why? Because they each represent things you don't understand. There's a god of the sky, there's a god of the earth, there's a god of all these different things. In fact, some of the oldest sculptures, the oldest ever that have been preserved, are these carvings of a goddess Mother Earth, which they're very simple carvings showing a pregnant woman, showing the earth as a mother. And there are these ancient carvings that can be found often around Western Europe. Now, the gods are thought to control these forces of nature. They're often ascribed to human characteristics. That's a fancy term called anthropomorphism. I did not make that up, I promise. Anthropomorphism, meaning that we tend to make things that we don't understand like ourselves. You know, you don't have to raise your hand, but we've all thought at one different time or another of God as a person, sitting on a chair, probably with a beard and gray hair. Maybe not. Again, I don't want to assume. But you've probably all thought at some time or another God as a person, or whatever deity you worship, as resembling you. Isn't that odd? Yes. Why should we assume that? Well, to be fair, we came by it honest, because guess what? Primitive people did the very same thing. I mean, look, this is the pantheon of Greek gods. Here's Zeus, looking pretty buff with his red robe. And yeah, he's got a beard and curly hair. Here's Poseidon fixing to throw a spear at somebody. He definitely had a temperamental problem. Why? Because the sea can be temperamental. And so we start to ascribe human characteristics to the gods. Life after death was often considered bleak and gloomy because, again, it's a mystery. And so there are different ancient terms for what happens when you die. Well, what about life in Sumerian society? This is one of the most ancient carvings in human history. It's cuneiform. It's a drawing symbolizing a story. At the top, you see the rulers. And then you see the business people in the middle. And then you see the slaves at the bottom. And that's one of the oldest drawings in the world, and it shows a stratified social class system. And it seems that we still haven't gotten over that, right?
Each city-state in Sumer has a king called an Ensi. We believe he was chosen by the gods to rule us, and that it was the gods who gave us our laws. Our king makes judgments when people have arguments. He's in charge of all our trade with other cities. He decides who gets to farm our fields. And he makes sure the gods' temples are in good repair and that all the right offerings are made. He's got a whole lot to do. So obviously, he needs other people to help him do it. My dad is one of them, and of course my brother helps because he's a priest. Maybe I'll work there too when I'm older. Scribes keep records on clay tablets of everything that happens each year. The king and the priests all work in the ziggurat. It's full of offices and workrooms and storage spaces. To support the king and the priests, our people pay taxes throughout the year. Usually, it's something like a couple of sheep or bags of grain. But there are taxes on almost everything. We get taxed on the livestock we own and on the fish we catch. We even get taxed on our funerals. In our city, every man who is head of a household has to pay a tax called the burden. It's not the usual kind of tax. It's time, not goods. The men have to spend time working for the government, doing things that help or protect the city. For example, my uncle helped to harvest the barley crop. Other men have to go dig out the irrigation ditches to keep them clear. Our neighbor sent one of his slaves to do his work. My dad says you're not supposed to, but people do it if they can afford it. All the taxes go to the king. They pay for our army, which is pretty expensive, and also for repairs and improvements to our city. My grandfather always says, there are priests and there are kings, but the tax man is the one you should be afraid of.
Now, these two panels depict scenes of war and peace. So I wanted to zoom in a little bit on what we saw. If you look very closely, this one shows peace and commerce. Here's the ruler handing out his rulings. He's being nice to everybody, and they're all smiling and happy. In this one, this guy has some kind of club axe thing that he's about to kill somebody with. So, yes, even in some of the most ancient drawings, you still see scenes of war and of peace. What about science and technology? Oh yes, somebody invented the wheel. It wasn't just always a thing. And we know who. The Sumerians invented the wheel. Why? Because, once more, one of the oldest drawings in the world contains this image of a wheel. So we got to give the Sumerians credit because they were at least the first to draw one. But they also invented the sail, the plow, and they were even the first to start digging for metals and fashioning them into tools. And the oldest metals to be used as tools were bronze, ergo the Bronze Age. Why? Because bronze can be fashioned without the need for extreme heat. You can just take raw bronze and a hammer and beat, boom, 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 and make a sword out of it. Now, because it can be fashioned by hand like that without heat, it's also not as tough as iron or steel, which will come later. But they made many advancements in arithmetic, geometry, developed arches, columns, ranges. They had their own complex system of writing. In fact, the Sumerians were the first to develop a system of writing called cuneiform. It's not that exciting. In fact, most of the early writings in cuneiform are business ledgers, literal spreadsheets showing sales, records of sales, etc. But it's important that these folks had these sophisticated systems that hitherto had never been seen in human history. That for tens of thousands of years, folks had wandered the earth, and that it wasn't until around the 3000s BCE that folks began to put these tools to use. Now, the first empire was the Akkadians. The Akkadians defeated many of the separate city-states in Sumer. And Sargon, the great conqueror, was the first to begin to unite these city-states. Of course, he did this by force, and then he passed down his empire to his son, who passed it down to his son, and the first ruling dynasty lasted about 200 years. Before they were conquered by someone else, it was conquered by someone else. Okay. Empire, the Babylonian Empire, was a group of nomadic warriors who took control of this region. Babylon, of course, was the first capital. And we'll talk about Hammurabi later, but I do this earliest empire here. And don't feel like you have to memorize all of this. Again, the video is there for reference. You'll have a chance to read through this in the book later. It's all there as well. But yes, so this was once the site of the famous Babylonian Empire.
4,000 years ago, in the cradle of civilization, the mighty King Gilgamesh built the great city of Uruk. Its walls stood higher and stronger than any in Mesopotamia. Its craftsmanship surpassed all others. And at the base of its gates, at the foundation of the city walls, there lies a stone of lapis lazuli. It is here that the story of Gilgamesh is carved. Gilgamesh, 1/3 human and 2/3 god, the strongest superhuman that ever existed. It was he who in his glory built the great walls of Uruk to keep his people safe from outside forces, but not from himself. He oppresses his people, and so they cry out to the sky god Anu. In response, Anu creates the wild man, Enkidu, to plague Gilgamesh's city. The wild man begins to attack the shepherds, killing their livestock and depriving them of food. Complaints are brought before Gilgamesh, and the great king sends Shamhat, a temple harlot, to seduce Enkidu. In his wisdom, Gilgamesh knows that bodily contact between the two will tame the wild man, and he will lose his savagery. Upon their return to Uruk, Shamhat and Enkidu find Gilgamesh attending a wedding. He demands that as king, it is his right to be first to sleep with the bride. Enkidu is outraged and challenges Gilgamesh to a test of strength. Should Gilgamesh be unable to pass Enkidu and enter the temple, then he must give up his right. Late into the day they fight, until finally, as the moon takes to the sky, Gilgamesh gains the upper hand, forcing Enkidu to concede his superiority. The wise king, however, honors Enkidu's wishes, and they return to his palace as friends.
Sorry, we'll come back to that. Now, the Babylonians had their own legends, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I think that's B2 on your notes, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the famous first superhero story. So if you're a comic book fan, go back and check out the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's great stories on YouTube about it. But they're also the first empire builders. Hammurabi created the first code of laws. And this is also significant. Now, granted, it wasn't exactly a fair code. There's different rules if you're a man, if you're a woman. There's different punishments if you're a slave or if you're freed. But these 282 codes were all written down, and that's why it's important. But the Babylonians ruled for about 200 years after Hammurabi. That's what the code looks like, by the way. You can't see it, but all the different rules are posted at the bottom. And so that's it for today's lesson.